The temperature inside Tobias Whitlock's cabin had dropped to where he could see his breath with every exhale, and the woodpile outside held barely enough fuel to last 3 more days. His back, injured 6 weeks earlier when a widowmaker branch caught him across the spine, screamed with pain every time he bent to lift another log. He fed the fire constantly, watching flames consume wood at an alarming rate, while the January cold of 1842 seeped through every gap in the log walls. What Tobias discovered over the next 4 months would revolutionize heating across the Appalachian highlands and prove that sometimes the most wasteful-looking solution is actually the most efficient one ever created. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if stories of frontier innovation move you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode reveals an even more impossible survival technique from the mountain territories. The winter of 1842 arrived early in the Appalachian highlands of eastern Kentucky. Tobias Whitlock, 34 years old and a trapper of 12 seasons, had survived worse cold, harder storms, and leaner times. But he had never faced winter with an injury that made gathering firewood a dangerous, agonizing task. The accident happened in late October. He was felling a dead oak for winter fuel when a hanging branch, a widowmaker as mountaineers called them, broke free and caught him across the lower back. The impact drove him to his knees and left him unable to stand upright for 3 days. By the time he could move without blinding pain, he knew something had shifted in his spine that would never fully heal. Tobias lived alone in a cabin he had built 7 years earlier in a hollow near the headwaters of the Cumberland River. The location was remote even by frontier standards, a full day's travel from the nearest settlement. He preferred solitude and had established a successful trapping territory along the creeks and ridges surrounding his homestead. His cabin was typical of the region. Logs chinked with mud and moss, a single room measuring 16 feet by 20 feet, one window covered with oiled paper, and a fireplace built from fieldstone and clay mortar. The fireplace was adequate by mountain standards. It drew smoke properly, didn't leak rain, and provided heat when fed constantly. That constant feeding was the problem. Before his injury, Tobias could gather and split a week's worth of firewood in 2 days of hard work. After the accident, cutting and hauling a single day's supply took him 6 hours and left him barely able to move the next morning. The mathematics were brutal and simple. He could not gather wood fast enough to keep his cabin warm through winter. A standard fire in his fireplace consumed approximately 12 to 15 logs per day during cold weather. Each log required cutting, splitting, and hauling uphill to the cabin. With his injured back, he could safely manage perhaps 8 logs per day before risking complete incapacitation. The deficit would kill him long before spring. By early December, Tobias had burned through half his wood supply and faced a choice. He could leave the mountains and winter in the settlement, abandoning his trap lines and losing a year's income. He could risk permanent injury by pushing himself to gather more wood, or he could find a way to heat his cabin with less fuel. Most men would have chosen the first option. Tobias chose the third. He didn't know it yet, but that decision would change how people heated their homes across the entire Appalachian frontier. The solution began with observation, continued through obsession, and ended with an innovation so effective that neighbors who mocked it would beg him to build the same system in their own cabins. But first, he had to understand why his perfectly adequate fireplace was actually a dangerous, inefficient design that wasted more than half the heat it generated. Tobias began watching his fire with the intensity of a man whose life depended on understanding it, because his life did depend on it. He sat for hours studying how flames moved, how wood burned, how heat behaved. What he observed contradicted everything he thought he knew about fires. When smoke poured from burning wood, that smoke represented wasted fuel. Smoke was unburned particles escaping up the chimney, carrying potential heat with them. His fireplace produced constant smoke, especially when he added fresh logs. The wood smoldered more than it burned, generating smoke and consuming itself slowly while providing minimal heat. He noticed another problem. When flames did burn hot and clean, most of that heat went straight up the chimney. He could feel intense heat if he stood directly in front of the fireplace, but 2 steps back, the temperature dropped dramatically. The heat was escaping rather than warming the cabin. His fireplace was essentially a chimney with a fire in it, designed more for removing smoke than for heating space. Every frontier fireplace worked this way. Everyone accepted it as normal. Tobias began to see it as fundamentally flawed. The third problem was ash accumulation. He built his fires directly on the stone hearth floor, as everyone did. As wood burned, ash accumulated underneath the burning logs. The ash layer grew thicker, insulating the fire from airflow below and smothering the coals. He found himself raking ash constantly, but the moment he added new wood, ash began building up again. Coals that should have burned hot and complete died out while still containing combustible material, buried in their own waste. Tobias remembered working in his uncle's blacksmith shop as a young man in Virginia. The forge burned hotter than any wood fire he had ever seen, hot enough to make iron glow and bend. The key was airflow. The forge had bellows that pushed air through the coals from below. More air meant hotter fire, more complete combustion, less waste. A blacksmith could heat iron to working temperature using a surprisingly small amount of charcoal because the fire burned efficiently. Could the same principle apply to a cabin fireplace? He began experimenting outside his cabin, building small test fires. He stacked rocks to create a raised platform and built a fire on top, leaving gaps for air to flow underneath. The difference was immediate and dramatic. The fire burned hotter and cleaner with noticeably less smoke. Flames were brighter, more intense. When he compared it to an identical fire built on the ground, the elevated fire consumed wood slower while generating more heat. The principle worked. Tobias understood what he needed to do. He needed to rebuild his fireplace completely, creating a system where fire burned elevated above the hearth floor with air flowing underneath. He needed massive stone construction that would absorb heat and radiate it for hours after the fire died. He needed a design that worked with combustion rather than fighting it. His neighbors would think he was insane. It was December. Tearing apart his only heat source with winter closing in was suicidal by any reasonable standard. But Tobias had stopped being reasonable the moment he realized staying warm shouldn't require destroying his body gathering endless amounts of firewood. Tobias spent 3 days building a crude prototype outside his cabin using materials he already had. He found 4 iron bars in his tool cache, remnants from a broken beaver trap and some salvaged hardware he had collected over the years. The bars were rough, uneven, and not designed for what he intended, but they would serve for testing. He stacked stones to create a small firebox approximately 2 feet square and arranged the iron bars across the top, spacing them roughly 2 inches apart. The bars sat 6 inches above the stone floor, creating an air gap underneath. On December 8, 1842, he built identical fires using the same amount of wood. One fire sat directly on the ground in the traditional manner, the other burned on his elevated iron grate inside the stone box. He placed a kettle of water over each fire and measured how long it took to reach a full boil. The ground fire took 42 minutes and required him to add 2 additional logs to maintain sufficient heat. The elevated fire boiled water in 26 minutes using only the original fuel load. The difference was substantial enough that he repeated the experiment twice more over the next 2 days. The results remained consistent. Elevated fires with airflow from below burned approximately 40% hotter and consumed wood 30 to 40% slower. Tobias understood the mechanism. Air flowing up through the grate fed oxygen directly to the burning coals. The combustion was more complete, converting more of the wood's potential energy into actual heat rather than smoke. Ash fell through the grate instead of smothering the fire, keeping the coals exposed to airflow. The iron bars themselves heated up and radiated warmth, becoming an additional heating element. Everything about the design made fires more efficient. The implications were profound. If he could build a full-sized fireplace using these principles, he could heat his cabin with half the wood he currently burned. That would solve his immediate crisis. He could gather enough fuel to survive winter without crippling himself. But building such a fireplace meant dismantling his current heating source during the coldest months of the year. Most men would wait until spring. Tobias calculated he would run out of firewood by late January if he continued at current consumption rates. He didn't have until spring. He made his decision on December 11th. He would tear out his existing fireplace and rebuild it completely, using elevated grate design and massive stone construction for heat retention. The work would take weeks. During construction, he would have no fireplace at all, only whatever heat he could generate from his outdoor test fire. The temperature was already dropping below freezing at night. His neighbors, the few who lived within a day's travel, would hear about this eventually. They would think he had lost his mind. Thomas Garrett, who lived 8 miles downstream, had already called Tobias peculiar for his habit of measuring and recording everything. Destroying your only heat source in December would confirm Garrett's opinion that Tobias Whitlock was dangerously eccentric. But Tobias had learned to trust his observations over other people's opinions. The elevated grate worked. Now he needed to build it properly. Tobias began gathering stones on December 12th, working in short sessions to protect his injured back. He needed specific types of rock, not just any stone he could find. Most mountaineers grabbed whatever rocks were convenient and mortared them together with clay. Tobias understood that stone selection would determine whether his fireplace worked as intended or failed completely. He needed stones that would absorb heat during burning and release it slowly over hours. He needed flat surfaces that could be fitted tightly together to create maximum thermal mass with minimum gaps. He needed rocks that wouldn't crack or explode when exposed to intense, repeated heating. The creeks and hillsides around his cabin offered abundant stone, but finding the right pieces required careful searching. He focused on sedimentary rocks, specifically limestone and sandstone. These formations occurred naturally in layers, breaking into flat or gently curved pieces, perfect for stacking. Limestone was particularly valuable because it absorbed and held heat exceptionally well. Sandstone was slightly more brittle but still effective and often came in larger flat sections. He avoided granite and other igneous rocks. They were harder and more durable, but they didn't absorb heat as efficiently and sometimes cracked under thermal stress. Each stone was evaluated for size, shape, thickness, and surface quality. He needed large anchor stones for the base and corners, medium stones for the main wall construction, and smaller pieces for filling gaps. The stones had to be thick enough to store significant heat, but not so heavy that he couldn't move them with his injured back. He settled on pieces ranging from 5 pounds for small gap fillers to 40 pounds for the largest structural stones. Anything heavier would require help he didn't have. The gathering process was brutally slow. He would hike to a creek bed or exposed hillside, select suitable stones, and carry them back to the cabin in a leather pack or dragged on a makeshift sled. His back allowed him to work for perhaps 2 hours before the pain became unbearable. 2 hours of stone gathering yielded maybe 8 to 12 usable pieces. He needed hundreds. The work stretched across 3 weeks of December cold, with Tobias moving stones day after day while his woodpile dwindled and temperatures dropped. Thomas Garrett visited on December 19th and found Tobias sorting stones by size and shape outside his cabin. Garrett stared at the growing pile of carefully selected rocks and shook his head. "Any stone will hold a fire," he said. "You're wasting time being particular." Tobias explained his theory about thermal mass and heat retention. Garrett listened politely, then pointed out that Tobias was burning through firewood to stay warm while spending his days moving rocks instead of cutting more fuel. The observation was valid, but missed the larger point. Tobias wasn't preparing for this winter alone. He was building something that would reduce his firewood needs for the rest of his life. By January 3, 1843, Tobias had accumulated enough stone to begin construction. His woodpile held perhaps 10 days of fuel at current consumption rates. He had no margin for error and no time to reconsider. The next morning, he began tearing out his existing fireplace. The iron grate was the critical component of Tobias's design, and he didn't have the materials or skills to forge it himself. On January 5th, he packed supplies for travel and made the 2-day journey to Hazard, the nearest settlement with a working blacksmith. The trip was risky with his back injury and the January cold, but without proper iron grating, his entire fireplace design would fail. He carried his crude prototype bars to show the blacksmith exactly what he needed, along with careful measurements he had written on a piece of birch bark. The blacksmith was a German immigrant named Heinrich Vogel, who had established his shop 3 years earlier. Vogel was skilled and practical, but he looked at Tobias's design with obvious skepticism. The grate needed to be approximately 3 feet wide and 2 feet deep, with bars spaced 2 inches apart, running front to back. The bars themselves needed to be thick enough to support burning logs without warping from heat, at least 3/4 of an inch square in cross-section. Vogel examined the measurements and asked the obvious question, why would anyone build a grate that let coals and ash fall through? You're throwing away heat. Tobias explained his theory about airflow and complete combustion. Vogel listened, but his expression showed doubt. He had been forging iron for 20 years and had built fireplace equipment for dozens of homes. Nobody used elevated grates. Fires were built on hearth floors because that was how fires worked. Tobias was proposing to waste good coals by letting them drop through gaps. Still, Vogel was a businessman. If Tobias wanted to spend money on unusual metalwork, that was his choice. The iron would cost $4, a significant sum representing nearly a week of Tobias's trapping income. The forging work would take 2 days. Tobias paid half in advance and spent those 2 days in Hazard, sleeping in the stable loft and eating sparingly to conserve money. He used the time to observe other buildings in the settlement, particularly the brick structures with their formal fireplaces. Most were built shallow, with poor heat retention, wasting fuel just like frontier cabins. But the general store had a deeper firebox and thicker walls that seemed to hold warmth better. Tobias studied the proportions and angles, storing observations for his own construction. On January 8th, Vogel completed the grate. He had forged it in 3 separate sections that could be fitted together, making transport possible. The iron was heavy, perhaps 35 pounds total, but well crafted. The bars were straight and evenly spaced. The joints were solid. Vogel had done excellent work despite his doubts about the design. As Tobias prepared to leave, Vogel offered a final warning. Iron costs money. If this doesn't work, you've wasted resources you can't afford to waste. Tobias thanked him and began the journey home. He arrived back at his cabin on January 10th. The temperature had dropped below 0 during his absence. His carefully rationed woodpile had diminished further. He had perhaps 6 days of fuel remaining at normal consumption. Starting tomorrow, he would dismantle his fireplace and begin construction. There would be no heat source except small outdoor fires. If the design failed or took too long to complete, he would freeze. Tobias unpacked his iron grate and prepared to test whether his theories could become reality. On January 11, 1843, Tobias began dismantling the fireplace that had kept him alive for 7 winters. He worked carefully, salvaging stones that were still sound and discarding those weakened by years of heat exposure. The chimney structure above the roofline would remain intact, but everything from the firebox to the throat needed complete reconstruction. By midday, he had reduced his heating system to rubble and exposed the log wall behind it. The cabin immediately felt colder, more vulnerable. He built a small fire outside, using his prototype grate system, and left the door open, trying to direct some warmth inside. It helped minimally. The foundation came first. Tobias cleared the existing hearth down to the cabin floor and dug a shallow depression approximately 4 inches deep. He filled this with his largest, flattest stones, creating a level base that extended 2 feet out into the room from the wall. This hearth floor needed to be absolutely level and stable because everything above would depend on it. He used clay mixed with sand for mortar, filling gaps between stones and creating a solid platform. The clay needed time to set, so he left it overnight despite the cold. January 12th brought clearing skies and temperatures around 15 degrees. Tobias began building the firebox walls. He started with his largest stones at the corners, creating anchor points for the entire structure. Each stone was positioned carefully, with flat surfaces facing inward to create smooth firebox walls. He used minimal mortar, relying instead on precise fitting to create tight joints. The technique was slower than slapping stones together with thick mortar layers, but it created superior thermal contact between rocks. Heat would transfer through stone-to-stone contact far better than through mortar gaps. The firebox dimensions were critical. He built it 30 inches deep, twice the depth of his previous fireplace. The extra depth would allow complete combustion and create space for his grate system. The width was 36 inches, matching his iron grate dimensions. The height from hearth floor to throat would be 40 inches, tall enough to create proper draft. As the walls rose, Tobias maintained precise measurements using a marked stick and regular checks with a plumb line made from cord and stone. The work proceeded in sessions of 2 to 3 hours before his back forced him to rest. During rest periods, he fed his outdoor fire and huddled near it for warmth. At night, he wrapped himself in every blanket and fur he owned and slept fitfully in the freezing cabin. The temperatures dropped to near zero several nights. He woke with frost on his blankets and ice in his water bucket. Thomas Garrett stopped by on January 15th and found Tobias building walls in a cabin cold enough to see breath. Garrett said nothing, just shook his head and left. The look on his face said everything. He thought Tobias would die of cold before finishing this foolish project. By January 17th, the firebox walls stood complete. Tobias had used nearly 200 stones, each positioned deliberately for maximum thermal mass and structural integrity. The walls were 8 to 10 inches thick, creating massive heat storage capacity. Tomorrow he would build the fireback and begin the throat construction. His woodpile held perhaps 3 days of fuel. The rear wall of the firebox, the fireback, required Tobias's flattest and largest stones. This vertical surface would face the flames directly and absorb the most intense heat. He selected stones with maximum surface area, rejecting any with significant curves or irregularities. Each stone needed to present a flat face to the fire while fitting tightly against its neighbors. The fireback would become the primary heat storage component, absorbing thermal energy during burning and radiating it into the cabin for hours afterward. Tobias spent an entire day, January 18th, positioning just 12 stones that formed the lower half of the fireback. Each required careful fitting and checking for plumb. As the fireback rose, Tobias began angling it slightly forward, perhaps 5 degrees from vertical. This angle would reflect heat outward into the room rather than straight up the chimney. Most fireplaces had vertical firebacks that sent heat upward where it was wasted. The forward angle was subtle but significant. Heat radiating from the hot stone surface would project into the cabin space instead of escaping. He had observed this principle in his uncle's blacksmith forge, where angled surfaces directed heat toward the work area. At the top of the firebox, Tobias began constructing the throat, the critical transition between firebox and chimney. The throat needed to narrow significantly from the firebox width to create proper draft, while preventing excessive heat loss. He built it approximately 8 inches wide, less than a quarter of the firebox width. This narrowing created a Venturi effect, accelerating smoke and gases upward while restricting the amount of room air that could be pulled up the chimney. A wide throat would draw too much heated air from the cabin. A narrow throat maximized heat retention while still removing smoke efficiently. Behind the throat, Tobias created a smoke shelf, a horizontal ledge that prevented downdrafts from blowing smoke back into the cabin. Cold air descending the chimney would hit this shelf and deflect upward, never reaching the firebox. The smoke shelf also reflected heat back down into the room. Building it required careful stone placement to create an overhang without compromising structural integrity. He used 3 large flat stones, each overlapping the one below, cantilevered out to form the shelf. Clay mortar secured them, but the real strength came from the weight of the chimney stones above pressing down. On January 21st, Tobias reached the point where his new construction met the existing chimney structure. The connection had to be perfect to maintain draft and prevent smoke leaks. He spent hours fitting stones and applying mortar to create a seamless transition. By evening, the entire firebox and throat system stood complete. The structure was massive, using nearly 400 pounds of stone. It looked nothing like a standard frontier fireplace. The deep firebox appeared cavernous. The narrow throat seemed too small. The forward-angled fireback looked wrong to anyone familiar with conventional construction. Tomorrow, Tobias would install his iron grate system and attempt the first fire. His outdoor fire had burned down to coals. The temperature was dropping. He had perhaps 2 days of firewood remaining and no backup plan if this failed. He wrapped himself in blankets and tried to sleep despite the cold and the knowledge that everything depended on tomorrow. January 22, 1843, dawned clear and brutally cold. Tobias woke to temperatures well below zero and ice crystals coating the inside of his cabin walls. He had slept poorly, too cold for rest, too anxious about the test ahead. He spent the morning preparing the fireplace for its first fire, sweeping out construction debris and positioning his iron grate sections. The 3 pieces of grating fit together precisely, creating a solid platform that sat 6 inches above the hearth floor. The elevated position created an air chamber beneath where oxygen could flow upward through the 2-inch gaps between bars. He gathered kindling and split several pieces of dry pine into thin strips for starting the fire. His hands shook slightly, whether from cold or nervousness, he couldn't determine. Everything depended on the next hour. If the fireplace didn't draw properly, smoke would fill the cabin. If the grate system failed, he had wasted weeks and resources he couldn't afford to lose. If the design simply didn't work as theorized, he would have no time to rebuild before his firewood ran out. He arranged kindling on the grate, struck sparks with his flint and steel, and watched flames catch and grow. Initial smoke filled the firebox as the fire established itself. For 30 seconds, Tobias worried the throat was too narrow, the draft insufficient. Then suddenly, the chimney began drawing. Smoke streamed upward and disappeared. The fire built quickly, burning with surprising intensity. Flames wrapped around the kindling in a way Tobias had never seen in his old fireplace. The combustion was different, more complete, almost violent in its efficiency. He added larger pieces of split wood, carefully placing them across the grate. The fire consumed them eagerly. Within 10 minutes, Tobias felt heat radiating from the firebox. Not the weak, localized warmth of his previous fireplace, but powerful, projecting heat that reached across the cabin. The stone fireback was already warming, beginning its function as a thermal mass battery. The iron grate bars glowed dull red, radiating heat downward and outward. Smoke was minimal, just faint wisps compared to the constant stream his old fireplace produced. The fire was burning clean and hot, converting wood to heat with remarkable efficiency. Tobias stood 3 feet from the fireplace and felt warmth on his face and chest. He stepped back 6 feet, still warm. 8 feet. He could still feel heat. His previous fireplace had been uncomfortably hot at 2 feet and barely warm at 4. This system was projecting heat throughout the entire cabin space. He added more wood, building up the fire to test the grate's capacity. The iron bars supported the load easily. Ash began falling through the gaps, accumulating on the hearth floor below while the burning coals remained elevated and exposed to airflow. 2 hours later, the cabin temperature had risen noticeably. Tobias's breath was no longer visible. The ice on the walls began melting. The stone fireback radiated heat like a sun. He had burned perhaps 4 logs, half what his old fireplace would have consumed, to achieve far less warming. The design worked. Tobias spent the remainder of January documenting his fireplace's performance with the same obsessive precision he applied to everything. He counted every log burned, measured the time each fire maintained heat, and recorded how long the stone mass radiated warmth after flames died. The results were consistent and dramatic. His new fireplace consumed 6 to 7 logs per day to maintain comfortable cabin temperature compared to 12 to 15 logs his previous fireplace required. The stone mass held heat for 4 to 6 hours after the fire went out, meaning he could let fires die at night and still wake to a warm cabin. He was using half the wood while staying warmer. By early February, his wood supply stabilized. He could gather enough fuel to stay ahead of consumption even with his injured back. The crisis that had driven him to rebuild had passed. But the vindication came not from his own success, but from his neighbors' reactions. Thomas Garrett returned on February 9th, expecting to find Tobias frozen or defeated. Instead, he found the cabin warm and Tobias comfortably working on trap repairs. Garrett stepped inside and immediately felt the difference. The heat was even, pervasive, nothing like the weak warmth most frontier fireplaces provided. Garrett examined the fireplace with growing interest. The deep firebox, the elevated grate system, the massive stone construction. Everything he had dismissed as wasteful or foolish was functioning exactly as Tobias had claimed it would. Garrett asked direct questions. "How much wood are you burning? How long does the heat last? Can it really work as well as it seems? Tobias showed him the measurements he had recorded. Garrett studied the numbers, then asked if Tobias would help him build a similar fireplace. The mockery was gone, replaced by genuine respect. Word spread through the scattered mountain community. Other trappers and settlers visited to see Whitlock's peculiar fireplace. Most arrived skeptical and left convinced. A trapper named James Kirkland came in late February, suffering through a winter of constant wood gathering and inadequate heat. His wife was ill, and keeping their cabin warm enough for her recovery was exhausting their wood supply. Kirkland studied Tobias's design for an hour, asking detailed questions about stone selection, grate construction, and firebox dimensions. 2 weeks later, he returned asking Tobias to help rebuild his fireplace. Tobias spent 5 days at Kirkland's cabin in early March, guiding the construction while Kirkland did the physical labor. The result was a faithful reproduction of Tobias's design, adapted slightly for the materials and space available. Kirkland's wife recovered in a cabin that stayed consistently warm while using dramatically less firewood. She called it a miracle. Kirkland called it the smartest building technique he had ever seen. By spring of 1843, 3 more families had rebuilt their fireplaces using what the community began calling Whitlock hearths. The name stuck despite Tobias never claiming ownership or seeking recognition. He shared his techniques freely, explaining the principles to anyone who asked. The innovation spread not through promotion, but through demonstrated results. When people saw efficiency and comfort that exceeded anything they had experienced, they adopted the methods. Superior design required no advertisement. Over the following decade, Whitlock-style fireplaces spread throughout the Appalachian highlands of Kentucky and Tennessee. The adoption was organic, driven entirely by practical results rather than formal promotion. Trappers and settlers who visited cabins with these fireplaces invariably noticed the difference in warmth and comfort. When they learned about the reduced wood consumption, most decided to rebuild their own heating systems. By 1850, an estimated 40 to 50 cabins in the region featured variations of Tobias's design. The specific details varied based on available materials and individual skill levels, but the core principles remained consistent. Elevated grate systems for airflow, deep fireboxes for complete combustion, massive stone construction for thermal mass storage, and narrowed throats for draft control. The innovation proved particularly valuable for elderly settlers, injured trappers, and families with limited capacity for constant wood gathering. A widow named Martha Hensley, living alone after her husband's death in 1846, survived 3 winters in comfort using a Whitlock hearth that required only minimal wood collection. She lived independently until age 72, something that would have been impossible with a standard fireplace demanding constant fuel. Similar stories emerged throughout the region. People who would have struggled or failed with conventional heating systems thrived with efficient fireplaces that respected their limitations. Professional masons and builders began incorporating the principles into formal construction as settlements grew. The town of Hazard saw several brick homes built in the 1850s featuring deep fireboxes, elevated grate systems, and careful attention to thermal mass. Heinrich Vogel, the blacksmith who had doubted Tobias's original design, found himself forging fireplace grates regularly by 1848. He admitted to Tobias during a chance meeting that he had been wrong. The elevated grate system worked better than any traditional design he had seen in 25 years of metalworking. Tobias himself continued trapping until 1854, when declining beaver populations and changing markets made the profession unsustainable. He transitioned to farming, working a small plot in the same hollow where he had built his revolutionary fireplace. He married in 1856, a widow from the settlement who had heard stories about the trapper with the warm cabin. They raised 2 children in that cabin, heated by the same fireplace Tobias had built during the desperate winter of 1843. The structure never required major repairs, testament to the quality of its construction. Tobias Whitlock died in 1876 at age 68, surrounded by family in the cabin he had built 34 years earlier. His fireplace was still functioning perfectly, still heating efficiently, still using half the wood of conventional designs. He was buried on the hillside above his cabin, overlooking the hollow where he had gathered stones during that cold December so long ago. The legacy of Tobias Whitlock's innovation extended far beyond his lifetime. It demonstrated that frontier survival wasn't about enduring hardship through toughness alone, but about observing problems carefully, thinking through solutions systematically, and having the courage to rebuild everything when you discovered a better way. Sometimes the most wasteful-looking decision, tearing apart your heating system in winter, becomes the most efficient choice ever made.